It's the Evidence-Based Program Fund. That fund was created when Senate Bill 367 was passed that reformed the juvenile justice system in Kansas. Savings achieved from that being deposited in the fund to support community-based programs. It's been a little slow on the uptick. There's been some of those programs developed and put in place across the state, but there remains a very significant balance in that fund today. And the governor, as a part of her budget proposal, and she spoke of this during the allotment process, would like to lay claim to that and use those funds to help balance the state general fund overall. What I would suggest to you is please say to the governor on this issue what Barbara Bush said to America about drugs. Just say no, and let's preserve those funds for the purpose of which they were originally intended, which is to intervene in the lives of young people who have run afoul of the law or are at risk of running afoul of the law, that they might get on a better path and grow to be law-abiding, self-sufficient adults. In addition to preserving that fund, I would suggest to you that we expand the role and purpose of that fund to include a more proactive approach to addressing juvenile crime through a transfer from the fund into prevention grants for the Department of Corrections that would be received at the community level to supplement, augment, if you will, their current prevention grant funding. And I would recommend to you that that transfer be in the amount of $1 million, and you basically double the amount of prevention funds available at communities now. Roughly, it's 100 or 106 thousand or 1.06 million, something like that. In addition to that, I would suggest to you that you transfer an additional $500,000 to the Department of Corrections to be administered to augment and support additional prevention programming, but that this be done on a cash match basis, that communities would be eligible to apply for a grant, that they would have to demonstrate dollar for dollar cash match, and that match could come from any source other than state funds that they receive to support the juvenile justice system, and get some more local buy-in, if you will, local participation, a little local ownership of supporting these programs. I think if we do this, there are additional programs that can be put in place that will help keep kids out of the system. That's the at-risk population. They haven't yet offended, but they're on a path that they're likely to if there's no intervention. And then one item not in my testimony that I've thought about a little bit from the Joint Committee meeting over the summer, I would ask that you consider a proviso recommendation to the Appropriations Committee that instructs the Secretary of Corrections to study and report back to the legislature at the beginning of the next legislative session the potential of repurposing the Kansas Juvenile Corrections Complex located here in Topeka, which is the only existing juvenile correctional facility, for some other purpose, and include in that plan the construction potential for 3 or more, if he chooses, regionally dispersed, smaller juvenile correctional facilities so that they are located closer to families, closer to the communities that they come from, and that they're smaller in size. The research in this field is really clear that the smaller these facilities are, the smaller the population in those facilities, the more effective they are. And when they're closer to families, you have a much better chance of family engagement, family involvement, visitation, and the like. So, you know, you have staff that can whip up a proviso proposal, but I just wanted to toss that out there. I've been thinking about that, and I think it's something that's worth asking the Secretary to just spend a little time to see if there's an opportunity there to improve outcomes for kids who are deep-end kids that are committed to these facilities for lengthy periods of time. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I will stand for questions, and I appreciate you taking me first. I really do.
Yeah, our meetings have been running a little bit late, so I didn't want to bore you with all of our inane conversations. Anybody have any questions for Representative Jennings at this point? I know it's a little early. Go ahead, Representative Hoheisel. Oh, excuse me, Delperdang.
That's an inside joke here. I do have a question, but it's going to seem, it's a little bit off the page from what you were talking about. But yesterday, I think it was yesterday, we had testimony from Scott Schultz. And for the record, he's not in here to defend it. So I just want to bring this up. But in their Kansas sentencing budget, they reduce the amount for drug rehab. And I'm concerned about the number of years I've sat in your committee and I see this, and what is the ramifications of that? Is it going to affect this? Is it going to affect these other guys standing in here?
Are you speaking to the Senate Bill 123 program funds?
Yes.
So obviously, any program is limited by the amount of the appropriation that the legislature gives to it. Not only do we have the existing pool of potential individuals to go through those programs, but, you know, within my committee, we've had no less than probably 3 bills at this point that are suggesting that a stronger and more robust community-based treatment system will likely result in fewer people going to prison. You know, think about just the dollars and cents, 25 grand to lock somebody up in prison per head versus $3,500 for treatment in the community if it's effective. You know, I guess I would just say, if you diminish those options, the ultimate outcome is you're likely to end up with more people in prison at a higher cost and a poorer outcome in the end.
Thank you. I appreciate your answer on that.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much, Representative. All right, we'll get back on track with our normal plan, and we'll have a budget overview by Merle Riedel with Legislative Research. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can everyone hear me all right? Thank you. I am Merle Riedel. I am the fiscal analyst with Legislative Research. Today, I'll be reviewing the budget for the Department of Corrections and the 9 correctional facilities for FY 2020 and FY 2021 and FY 2022. So we'll talk a little bit of the overview and the issues addressed since the previous session. We'll go over the agency's revised estimate for FY 2021, including supplemental requests. We'll talk about the governor's recommendation for FY 2021. Then we'll review the agency's request for FY 22, including enhancement requests and the reduced resource budget. Just a few terms I want to clarify before I get too far into this, because I think this will help you kind of understand how this is structured. When you hear me say the words KDOC system, I am referencing the Department of Correction, the 8 adult correctional facilities, and the 1 juvenile correctional facility. So that's the whole system, all of them working together. When you hear me reference the central office, that really is the Department of Corrections. So that's, when I'm talking about the central office, I'm sort of excluding all those correctional facilities. And then when you hear me talk about facilities, I'm talking about the 9 facilities, so the 8 adult facilities and the 1 juvenile correctional facility. So as we go through the budget analysis, you'll often hear me talk about the system, the whole big operation, then I'll drill down on the central office, and then I'll drill down on the facilities. Also available with me here today is the staff from the Kansas Department of Corrections. We have Secretary of Corrections Jeff Zumuda is here, Keith Bradshaw, Executive Director of Contracts and Finance, Randy Bauman, Public Affairs Executive Director, and online, I believe we have Deputy Secretary of Facilities Joel Raby, Deputy Secretary of Adult and Community-Based Services Hope Cooper, and I believe Margie Phelps is also online. Margie Phelps is the Executive Director for Programs. All right, so we're going to get started. We're going to go to page 341, looking at the agency overview. The Kansas Department of Corrections provides supervision to adult felony offenders in the state, including inmates incarcerated in one of 8 adult correctional facilities, post-release supervision or parole, and community-based supervision, probation, and treatment-oriented sentencing. The system consists of the Kansas Department of Corrections Central Office, 8 adult correctional facilities, and the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex. I would also keep in mind this system also includes about 20 parole offices spread throughout the state, an established relationship with a variety of community corrections agencies throughout the counties. All right, I'm going to move on to page 342 And if you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see the 2020 legislature passed House Bill 6032 last year, which disapproved ERO number 44. And if you'll all remember, ERO number 44 proposed to combine KDAD's juvenile services from the Kansas Department of Corrections and DCF and oversight of the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex to create a new organization called the Department of Human Services. You will see a similar EROs in circulation this year. This year's version is slightly different and does not involve juvenile services from the Department of Corrections. Last year, the legislature approved a budget that added 6.1 million SGF in FY 2020 and 7.2 million SGF in FY 2021 for capacity expansion projects at Lansing and Winfield correctional facilities. So kind of keep those numbers in mind because there's a little bit more to that story that's taken place this year and will impact FY 22. During the meantime, the legislature ratified the governor's emergency declaration in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which resulted in periodic closures of state offices to mitigate disease spread. Furthermore, guidance from the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention indicated that congregated populations at correctional facilities were vulnerable to COVID-19 infections among residents and staff due to close proximity and underlying conditions. So this group has heard from several agencies that were impacted by the COVID-19. Oftentimes it was $3,000 to purchase laptop computers or to purchase sanitizing material. I would say that the Department of Corrections was substantially more impacted than that. And you'll see in the end, when we look at some of the proposals, there's about $30 million from the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund that will be utilized at the Kansas Department of Corrections to help deal with some of the impacts of the pandemic. So the legislature also passed Senate Bill 102, which allowed for the delay of court proceedings in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The delay resulted in an unforeseen decrease in prison population. The legislature also passed HB 2016, which appropriated federal relief funds provided in the Federal Coronavirus Aid, Relief, Economic Security, or CARES Act to aid in response to the pandemic. So the largest of this fund was the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was allocated by the governor Strengthening People and Revitalizing Kansas, or the SPARK Task Force. And the SPARK Task Force decisions were all subject to approval by the State Finance Council. So that gives us a little context. So now I'm going to ask you to move on to, I would ask you to move on to page 348, where you'll see some of the 10-year budget trends. I won't go into that because I'm going to run out of time here if I go into some of these too much. I would draw your attention to the following page, 349. You'll see a large table. The item I want you to look at on that table is down below under the financing. You'll see a row called Federal CARES Act. So my attempt was to call this out so that you guys would have a clear understanding of money related to coronavirus relief that was going to this agency. The majority of that fund is from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, but the agency did receive some additional relief fund from the U.S. Department of Justice, a small grant about $1.7 million. Okay, I'd ask you to move on to page 340, and we're going to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of FY 2021. Yeah, I'm sorry, page 350. You should see a budget overview, FY 2021 current year at the top left. Moving down to those first set of bullets, adjustments to the approved state general fund. The FY 2020 legislature approved a state general fund budget of $427 million for the Kansas Department of Corrections and related facilities in FY 2021. Several adjustments were made subsequently, and those are highlighted with the bullets. You can see an increase of $48.6 million based on reappropriations of FY 2020 funding that was not spent in FY 2020 and is shifted to FY 21, and a decrease of about $7 million as a result of the governor's June 29th, 2020 SGF allotment. And that allotment is primarily related to those expansion projects that I mentioned earlier at Winfield, and Lansing. So last year when those projects were approved, there was $6.1 million approved for FY 20 7.2 approved for FY21. The governor allotted the expenditures for FY20, so the agency is now requested to move those expenditures to FY22. So you'll see a request of $6.1 million in FY22. So going below the box, the agencies request a revised estimate of $488.3 million, including $436.6 million SGF for operating and capital improvements for the entire KDOC system in FY 2021. So that's the whole shebang right there, capital improvements and operating for central office and all the facilities. This is an all funds decrease of $25.2 million and an SGF decrease of $32.1 million below the FY 2021 approved amount. The revised estimate includes 3,364.5 FTE positions for the KDOC system, which is an increase of 22 FTE positions above the FY 2021 approved amount. The KDOC Central Office, or the Department of Corrections, requests a revised operating budget of $258.4 million, including $221.1 million SGF in FY 2021. This is an all funds decrease of $33.7 million and an SGF decrease of $36.6 million below the FY 2021 approved amount. So the decrease is primarily attributed to decreased expenditures from the evidence-based juvenile programs account, so a total of $42.2 million, to align with the governor's proposed allotment plan. Such an allotment requires legislative approval pursuant to KSA 753722, and that, in fact, is what this group is here to do, is to suggest approval or disapproval of that allotment. The decrease is also attributed to a decreased salaries and wages expenditures of $5 million to transfer to individual correctional facilities for shrinkage reduction. So the 2020 legislature approved $5 million for the central office last year with the intent that the central office distribute that to the facilities. So that's why you see that decrease in expenditures there, because the central office has distributed that $5 million to the facilities. The shrinkage reduction allowed facilities to fill vacant positions. The decrease is partially offset by increased expenditures for the agency's supplemental request to fully fund the correctional system's medical services contract at $9.4 million and food service contract at $665.185. The agency budgeted $10.6 million for 360 contracted beds for adult male inmates at the Saguaro Correctional Facility in Eloy, Arizona, and 45 contracted beds for female inmates at county jails. The revised estimate includes 516 positions, which is an increase of 9.5 FTE positions, and the increase is mainly the addition of domestic violence response coordinator positions in the victim services program and level of service specialist positions in offender programs. Below that, you can see a breakdown of major changes by categories of expenditures. I'm not going to go into that deeply. You can look at that for yourself, but I would ask you to move to page 352, and I'll hit, we're going to go to that second paragraph. And this is related to the capital improvements expenditures for the central office. So in FY 2021, the revised budget includes capital improvement expenditures for the KDOC central office of $13.7 million, including $7.2 million SGF. This is an all funds decrease of $2.1 million and an SGF decrease of $22,718 below the FY 2021 approved amount. The decrease is primarily attributed to the transfer of correctional institutions building fund monies from the central office to facilities for local repair and rehabilitation projects. So CBIF is a special revenue fund that exists. It draws revenue from or gaming revenues to this fund, and it's used for essentially to maintain the correctional facilities. Agency budgeted $7.2 million SGF for the first year of expenditures in 2-year capacity expansion projects that include a 200-bed substance abuse treatment center at the Lansing Correctional Facility and a 241 nursing care and substance abuse treatment center at the Winfield Correctional Facility. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to, so what you've heard so far is the system-wide. You've also heard the expenditures at the central office. So now we'll briefly review expenditures the agency is requesting for the facilities. The KDOC facilities request revised operating budgets totaling $212 million, including $208 million SGF in FY 2021. This is an all funds increase of $6.4 million and an SGF increase of $4.5 million above the FY 2021 approved amount. The increase is primarily attributed to that shrinkage rate reduction. So this would reflect that $5 million that has arrived at the facilities, which was approved by the 2020 legislature. The increase is also attributed to increased expenditures for group health care, overtime for facility staff, and building and vehicle maintenance services. The increase is partially offset by decreased expenditures for the Kansas Public Employees, or KPERS, plan, computer programming services. And the agency budgeted $1.5 million, all from the federal Corona Emergency Supplemental Justice Assistance Grant to temporarily use the former Larned Correctional Facility as a COVID-19 intake isolation unit for adult male offenders. So the revised estimate includes 2,848 FTE positions, and this is at the correctional facilities, which is an increase of 12.5 FTE positions above the FY 2021 approved amount. The increase is mainly related to the addition of 31 correctional officers at the Larned Correctional Mental Health Facility to support temporary COVID-19 intake isolation unit. So that's partially offset by a decrease of 22.5 correctional officer positions at the Topeka Correctional Facility due to cancellation of plans to house female adult inmates at the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex. Roughly 2 years ago, there was a plan envisioned to move some of the female inmates as capacity was approaching critical at Topeka Correctional Facilities. There was a plan to move them to KJCC, and those plans did not move forward. All right, so we've heard what the agency's request was. So now I will review what the governor's recommendation is. Governor recommends expenditures of $478.8 million, including $398.1 million SGF for the entire KDOC system in FY 2021. This is an all funds decrease of $9.5 million and an SGF decrease of $38.4 million below the agency's FY 2021 revised estimate. The recommendation includes 3,364.5 FTE positions, which is unchanged from the agency's revised estimate. For the KDOC Central Office, the recommendation includes $248.2 million, including $207 million SGF for operating expenditures. This is an all funds decrease of $10.1 million and an SGF decrease of $13.3 million, below the agency's FY 2021 revised estimate. So again, the recommendation includes a lapse of $42.2 million from the ending balance of the evidence-based juvenile programs account. So you can see that the agency, when they submitted their budget, planned for that reduction in expenditures. And with the governor's recommendation, she is actually recommending to lapse that money, so to take that money out of the account and take it back to the state general fund. The decrease is partially attributed to the lapse of SGF money, so other SGF monies that were reappropriated from FY 2020. Moving on to the full first bullet point, there's a decrease of $9.1 million SGF for contracted beds, primarily due to the return of inmates housed at the Saguaro Correctional Facility in Eloy, Arizona, and those inmates returned back to Kansas in December 2020. There's a decrease of $4 million SGF for inmate food services, which was a decrease of $2.3 million, and healthcare, a decrease of $1.7 million, essentially due to lower than anticipated prison population. Finally, you'll see an increase of $3.2 million from the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund due to an allocation from the Spark Task Force for salaries and wages of $2.6 million and procurement of personal protective equipment, $551,000, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The one thing I want to note with that Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund is that fund was, by federal guidance, that fund is not intended to be simply SGF replacement. It is really money that is meant to be available for expenditures that we go above and beyond what the agency may have planned for in response to the pandemic. However, federal guidance did clarify that areas such as public safety or correctional facility workers can be presumed that the majority of their work is related to the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I don't want to give the implication that the CRF funds can be used as a replacement for SGF, but there is a unique situation for a correctional facility. So the recommendation includes $13.7 million, including $7.2 million SGF for capital improvement expenditures at the KDOC central office. This is an increase of $58,788, all from Federal CARES Act funds, above the agency's revised estimate. The increase is attributable to an allocation of $58,000 from the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund to support establishment of a COVID-19 intake isolation unit at the Topeka Correctional Facility. The governor also recommends, again, the $7.2 million for first year expenditures for capacity expansion projects at Lansing and Winfield. So now we'll move on to the governor's recommendation for the facilities. The recommendation is $211.8 million, including $183 million SGF for operating expenditures in FY21. This is an all funds decrease of $140,000 and an SGF decrease of $25.1 million below the agency's FY 2021 revised estimate. The decrease is attributable to lapses totaling of $140,000 SGF, reappropriated from FY 2020 among all facilities. Probably more significantly, the recommendation includes an allocation of $25 million from the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund for salaries and wages expenditures, including meritorious service awards and shift differential, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This allocation is offset by a commensurate SGF decrease. So in essence, she has replaced SGF, $25 million, with $25 million from the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund. The recommendation includes 2,848 FTE positions, which is unchanged from the agency's revised estimate. The recommendation includes $5.1 million, all from special revenue funds for capital improvements at KDOC facilities. This is an increase of $726,000, all from CARES Act funds. The increase is due to an allocation for the construction of a COVID-19 quarantine unit at the Winfield Correctional Facility. So you'll see on page 354 provides details on the agency's supplemental requests. In essence, for the fully fund the medical contract, the agency requested $9.4 million FGF to fully fund the medical services contract for constitutionally required health care in FY 2021. The request includes expenditures that account for the growth of the population, rising healthcare costs, and $1.5 million for additional treatment of inmates infected with hepatitis C. I will note, you'll see about the fourth paragraph, the governor recommends $7.8 million to fully fund the medical services contract. So her recommendation is about $1.7 million below what the agency had requested. And this decrease is due to the lower prison population that was lower than projected. The agency also requested $655,000 to fully fund the food services contract for the adult correctional facilities, and the governor did not recommend this supplemental request. And again, that's essentially because of a lower prison population than previously anticipated. So, sir, that wraps up for FY 2021, so I can pause for questions or move on to FY 22.
Anybody have any questions on 2021 before we go into 2022? Representative Hauser.
Just a quick question. Merle, you may not be able to answer this, I don't know. But the prison population reductions, was that due to the courts being closed and, you know, nobody was sentenced to prison or anything like that?
Mr. Chairman, may I respond? So the agency would probably give you a more specific answer, but from what I've seen in data, it is primarily related to the court delay procedure. So it's not that additional inmates were released in any earlier way in a substantial amount. It's just less flowed in.
Representative Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Page 352, it said a decrease of 22.5 correctional officers' positions at the Topeka Correctional Facility. Were they just laid off?
I think that these were positions that were never filled. I think they were FT positions created to provide additional staffing for the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Center, and since those plans didn't move forward, those positions were not filled.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Chairman. Page 354, you just covered it, but getting into the 1.7 million decrease due to lower population. Now, I realize that's the 21 budget, and that goes until what, July 1st?
Correct.
Of this year?
It goes until June 30th of FY 2020, yes.
So is there a possibility that between now and then, the courts are starting to operate again, the population goes up, and are we going to be caught off guard, and is there a possible adjustment if needed?
So the Kansas Sentencing Commission, the folks we heard from yesterday, they do these projections, and they try to take into account for anomalies such as a court opening, and so their projections sort of take that into factor, and they would not be projected. Their projections do not indicate a flood of inmates entering the system.
So kind of a follow-up question. Let's assume there is an increase. Is this something we can revisit if that happened, or is this locked in stone once we're done?
So the FY 2021 is somewhat locked in stone. The FY 22, you'll see a sort of similar reduction based on prison population. You will get a second whack to adjust that in the next session.
Thanks.
Representative Resman.
Mr. Chairman, we're using CARES money to pay for several different things, aren't we, currently?
Correct.
And when that money runs out, are we going to have to pick up the difference, or are we going to have to continue paying into those programs when CARES money runs out?
I would say no. So that CARES money is in FY 21 is essentially used as SGF replacement for some of those salaries. So in FY 22, they essentially resume what their normal operating levels of SGF usage is. So it's not an increase as a result of CARES Act programs that are then left residual that SGS has to pick up. That's not what the budget would seem to indicate. There are some funds for unique expenditures such as quarantine sites or isolation sites, but I think those are meant to be sort of temporary in nature, and those would begin to collapse even once the pandemic is complete, if a pandemic can be complete.
Other questions? Oh, did I cut you off? Okay. Anybody else have a question? Okay, let's move on to 2022.
Okay, all right. Bad news, FY 22 is even more complicated, but no. I'll try to fly through it. Okay, so looking on page 356, I'm looking below that box. You'll see the agency's request $490.5 million, including $448.8 million SGF for operating and capital improvements for the entire KDOC system in FY 2022. This is an all funds increase of $2.1 million and an SGF increase of $12.3 million above the FY 2021 revised estimate. The request includes 3,333.5 FTE positions for the entire KDOC system, which is a decrease of 31 FTE positions below the FY 2021 revised estimate. For the central office, they request an operating budget of $265.7 million, including $233.2 million SGF for FY22. This is an all funds increase of 7.3 million and an SGF increase of 12.2 million above the FY 2021 revised estimate. The increase is primarily attributed to the agency's 11 enhancement requests. These include enhancements related to increases for certain staff salaries and retirement benefits, adjustments to the food and medical services for inmates, and shifting of expenditures from the Larned State Hospital to the Kansas Department of Corrections Central Office for aspects related to inmates. Further, the agency budgeted an enhancement of 1.5 million to partially finance the replacement of adult and juvenile offender management data systems. So the request includes 516.5 FTE positions. This is for the central office, and this is unchanged from the FY 2021 revised estimate. So you can see a breakdown by category of expenditures. I won't go into those, but I am going to hit capital improvements. If we go to page 357, the second to last paragraph, for FY22, the budget includes capital improvement expenditures for the KDOC central office of 13.3 million, including 6.1 million SGF. This is an all funds decrease of 413,000 and an SGF decrease of 1.1 million below the FY 2021 revised estimate. The agency budgeted 6.1 million SGF for the final year expenditures for 2-year capacity expansion projects at Lansing and Winfield. So FY20, FY21, we heard about the first year expenditures. So in FY22, they're now sort of renewing that core request for 6 million to complete that project. KDOC facilities request operating budgets totaling 211.5 million, including 209.5 million SGF for FY 2022. This is an all funds decrease of 420,000 and an SGF increase of 1.2 million from the FY 2021 revised estimate. The decrease is attributed to the elimination of 31 temporary correctional officer positions at the Larned Correctional Mental Health Facility. These positions were funded with that federal coronavirus supplemental justice assistance grant that supported temporary use of the former Larned Juvenile Correctional Facility as a COVID-19 intake site. And you'll see a couple other items that resulted in those decreases, such as utilities, officer and inmate uniforms, and maintenance and construction material. So before I get into the governor's recommendation, I'm actually going to ask you to skip to some pages, and we're going to quickly review the enhancement and reduce resource budget. And then we'll come back to look at the governor's recommendation, because I think that flow will help it make a little more sense. So I would ask you to turn to page 360. You can see a list of the enhancements the agency requests in FY22. I'm going to only hit those that the governor did retain in the recommendation. So below the box, you'll see fully fund the medical services contract. The agency requested 11.3 million SGF to fully fund the medical services contract for that constitutionally required inmate health care. The governor recommends 9.6 million for the medical services contract, which is a decrease of 1.7 million below the agency's request. This decrease is due to a lower than anticipated prison population. Next, we're going to go to page 361, the Adult and Juvenile Offender Management Data System. The agency requests 1.5 million SGF to partially finance replacement of the Adult Offender Management Information System, or OMIS, and the Juvenile Correctional Facility System, or JCFS. Implemented in the 1970s, these data systems track inmate location, inmate banking, custody classification, and various other functions that are central to the Department of Corrections. This is really sort of their main operating digital system. According to the agencies, these obsolete data systems utilize antiquated coding of which few technicians remain knowledgeable. In fact, this system was developed by the same developers that developed the Department of Labor's mainframe, which is somewhat unstable, and this system may achieve equal instability. The agency proposes to replace these systems with a single offender data management system tailored for correctional systems, such as those developed by Microsoft. The new system would consolidate management of adult and juvenile populations, provide interoperability with other justice-related entities, and allow for inclusion of evidence-based programming and rehabilitative aspects, while improving processes for offender containment and data collection to better determine outcomes. So the agency estimated replacement of the OMIS JCFS would total $20.8 million, financed over 5 years, concluding in FY 2026. And you can see there a box is sort of an outline of the agency's financing plan. So I'm going to ask you to move to the next page because I'm going to get to what the governor's alternative plan was. So on page 362, the governor recommends an enhancement of $79,182 instead of the $1.5 million that the agency requested, and a shift of $1.9 million in operating expenditures to capital improvements for debt service to support an alternative 7-year financing plan for replacement of the adult and juvenile offender management systems. So you can see a box below there. The plan begins in FY 2021 and concludes in FY 27 with a total project cost of $25.8 million, which includes an initial payment of $5 million, followed by principal payments on a $20 million loan and interest totaling $791,000. In FY 2021, the plan includes an initial payment of $5 million, which is financed with existing funds from the agency's general fee fund of $3 million, and the evidence-based juvenile programs account of the state general fund. So $2 million would be drawn from that account. In FY 2022, the plan includes expenditures of $2.1 million, which includes debt service principal payment of $1.9 million and debt service interest payment of $142,450. In FY 2022, expenditures are financed with $2 million from existing funds from the evidence-based juvenile programs account and an enhancement of $79,815 in new SGF in FY 22. All right, moving on to the next enhancement. You'll see at the bottom of the page is the Larned State Hospital. Larned State Hospital contract beds. So the agency requests 1.3 million SGF to shift funding from the Larned State Hospital to the KDOC Central Office related to the housing of 90 inmates with mental health needs. 2016, Larned State Hospital and KDOC entered into a memorandum of understanding in which 90 inmates with severe and persistent mental illnesses were transferred from the Larned State Hospital to the Department of Corrections. Due to capacity limitations within the correctional system at the time, 90 general population inmates were displaced to contracted jail beds to allow suitable space for mental health inmates at correctional facilities. As the funding of this care of these inmates continued to be included in the Larned State Hospital budget, Larned State Hospital transferred $1.3 million appropriated from their care each year to the Kansas Department of Corrections. So since then, both agencies have agreed to eliminate this interfund transfer and to replace it with a direct SGF appropriation to the central office where the final expenditures are and have been made. The governor does recommend the agency's enhancement request. Moving a little further down on page 363, you'll see Larned State Hospital food service contract. The agency requested $814,121 to shift funding from the Larned State Hospital to the Kansas Department of Corrections Central Office for the provision of food service at Larned Correctional Mental Health Facility. Since the opening of the Larned Correctional Mental Health Facilities, agencies have maintained agreement by which Larned State Hospital kitchens provide food preparation in exchange for inmate labor. In recent years, inmate labor at Larned State Hospital kitchens has resulted in damaged equipment, delays due to correctional facility lockdowns, and opportunities for contraband trafficking. The agencies have agreed to shift food service operations from the Larned State Hospital to the Larned Correctional Mental Health Facilities, where expenditures would then be integrated into the Department of Corrections' existing correctional food service contract with Aramark, As part of that Aramark contract, pricing is estimated to be $1.60 per meal, which is a decrease from the LSH rate of $4.59 per meal, which would result in a decrease of expenditures or savings totaling about $2.2 million. And the governor does recommend this enhancement. So I would ask you now to move to page 364. We're going to quickly go through some of the items that were listed on the reduced resource budget. So as you know, the governor requested that agencies identify a 10% cut in SGF as part of a reduced resource budget proposal. So we'll briefly go over some of the items that the agency requested and what the governor did with them. So cancellation of the expansion projects, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the top of page 365. The agency proposed possible cancellation of expansion projects at Lansing and Winfield. When they're developing their budget, they had already had the funds allotted in FY 2021. So if they were not going to get additional funds in 22, the proposed an option not to move forward with this project. The governor recommends partial adoption of this reduced resource proposal. The recommendation retains expenditures totaling $13.3 million for nursing care and substance abuse at Lansing and Winfield, which includes $7.2 million in FY21 and $6.1 million in FY22. However, the governor recommends shifting the funding source in FY22 from the state general fund to the state institutional building fund. So project would move forward at the same total expenditures as previously envisioned, except in FY22, she shifts the funding source for that project from SGF to a state institutions building fund. Next, you'll see the juvenile alternatives to detention fund lapse. The agency submitted a reduced resource proposal that includes lapsing $10 million from the Juvenile Alternatives to Detention Fund. Per KSA 794803, the fund is intended to support grants to counties for the development of community-based alternatives to juvenile detentions. Revenue to the fund in FY22 is estimated to be $3.5 million and includes an annual transfer from State Gaming Revenue Fund of $2.5 million. Expenditures from the fund in FY 2022 are estimated to be $3.5 million. The agency indicates that expenditures would leave the fund with an ending balance of $10.5 million. So moving on to page 366, the governor recommends partial adoption of this reduced resource proposal rather than lapse the funds from the balance of the Juvenile Alternatives to Detention Fund. The governor recommends utilizing $10 million from that fund to offset SGF monies for the provision of graduated sanctions grants awarded to juvenile community corrections agencies. So she's essentially using the special revenue fund to replace SGF for the provision of these grants to multiple community corrections agencies which exist at the county level. Contract bed reduction and the return of out-of-state inmates. These were both proposals that the agency put forward should the inmates be returned back from Arizona. And since the inmates have been returned, the governor adopted both of these reduced resource proposals. Moving to page 367, you'll see an item, central office staffing reduction. The agency submits a reduced resource budget that includes $1.9 million SGF for a 10% reduction in salaries and wages expenditures in the central office. Such a reduction would eliminate funding for 12 FTE positions. And the agency proposes to eliminate at least one position from each of those following areas. The governor recommends partial adoption of this reduced resource proposal. The recommendation reduces expenditures for the central office staffing by $450,000, but retains $450,776, but retains that for staffing in the central office. The reduction will eliminate funding for 6 FTE positions. Increased facilities shrinkage. The agency submitted a reduced resource budget that includes $497,000 to increase shrinkage rate among staff at correctional facilities. So in essence, mandating that they retain several positions vacant. Shrinkage is the intentional reduction of salaries and wages expenditures for authorized positions. The governor recommends adoption of this reduced resource proposal. And finally, the last item I want to hit is on page 367, Community Corrections Supervision Fund Transfer. The agency submits a reduced resource budget that includes transferring $326,123 to the SGF from the Community Corrections Supervision Fund. Per Kansas statute, the fund is intended for community supervisions of individuals convicted of certain DUI offenses. Fund revenue in FY22 is estimated to be $1.3 million and includes driver's license, reinstatement fees, DUI penalties. Expenditures from the fund in FY22 total $1.2 million for grants to community corrections agencies. The governor recommends partial adoption of this reduced resource proposal. Rather than transfer funds from this special revenue fund, the recommendation includes an SGF decrease of $326,000 for grants to community corrections agencies. So that was a very quick once-over of the enhancements and reduced resources. So I would ask you to go back to page 358. We're going to go over the governor's recommendation, and we'll try to, and I'll try to wrap up my piece. So looking at page 358, about the third paragraph down, the governor recommends expenditures of $466.6 million, including $408.9 million for the entire Kansas Department of Corrections system in FY 2022. This is an all funds decrease of $23.8 million and an SGF decrease of $39.9 million below the agency's FY 2021 revised estimate. Recommendation includes 3,333.5 FTE positions for the KDO system, which is unchanged from the agency's revised estimate. For the KDOC Central Office, the recommendation includes an operating budget of $239.9 million, including $197.5 million SGF for the central office in FY 2022. This is a decrease of $25.8 million and an SGF decrease of $35.8 million below the agency's FY 22 request. So the decrease is attributable to the governor not recommending several of the agency's enhancement requests and adopting a modified reduced resource budget. So some of the major changes, a decrease of 10.6 million SGF for contracted beds, primarily due to the return of those inmates from Arizona. A decrease of 10 million SGF for graduated sanction grants awarded to juvenile community corrections agencies. So that's offset by an increase of 10 million in expenditures from the Juvenile Alternatives to Detention Fund for the same purpose. A decrease of 4.4 million SGF for inmates food service and healthcare due to decreased prison population. A decrease of 4.1 million SGF due to the governor not recommending enhancement requests for unit team counselor and parole officer pay equity, nor enhanced retirement for parole and juvenile correctional officers. A decrease of 3.4 million SGF due to the governor not recommending, a decrease of 3.4 million SGF due to the governor recommending an alternative financing plan for replacement of the adult and juvenile offender data management system. So the governor does not recommend the agency's enhancement request of 1.5 million. However, to pay for replacement, the recommendation includes a shift of operating expenditures to capital improvements expenditures for debt service principal payments and a new SGF expenditures for debt service interest payment. A decrease of 2 million SGF due to the governor not recommending enhancement requests for safety and security equipment, vehicle replacement, and increased GPS monitoring. A decrease of $947,000 due to the governor adopting a reduced resources proposal that increases shrinkage among correctional facilities and reduces central office staffing. A decrease of $326,123 SGF due to the governor's partially adopting a reduced resource proposal that decreases expenditures for grants awarded to community corrections agencies for the supervision of probationers. The recommendation includes $15.2 million, including $1.9 million SGF for capital improvement expenditures at the Kansas Department of Corrections Central Office in FY22. This is an all funds increase of 1.9 million and an SGF decrease of 4.2 million from the agency's FY 2022 request. The increase is attributed to the shift of expenditures related to the replacement of the adult and juvenile offender management data systems from operating expenditures. Now they're coming into capital improvement expenditures. The recommendation also includes shifting expenditures of 6.1 million from state general fund monies, now would be funded with state institution building fund monies, for the final year expenditures of capacity expansion projects at the Lansing and Winfield correctional facilities. For the KDOC facilities, the governor concurs with the agency's request for operating and capital improvement expenditures in FY 2022. And so I can go into the programs. There's 11 programs within the central office, and then there is a program analysis for each of the correctional facilities. Much of the changes that you would see there are essentially changes that I have reviewed, but Mr. Chairman, I can go into those, or I can stand for questions if you like.
What's the will of the committee? Is there anything in that more detail anybody wants us to have him go over quickly, or do we want to wait and just ask questions as we feel the need? Okay. Any questions for the 2022 portion of the budget for Mr. Riedel? Okay, good job. Hang around. I'm sure we'll have something for you.
Absolutely.
Hey, one thing I did want to ask you, I just thought of it. Do you know if the State Building Commission has approved their capital improvements yet?
So the capital improvements budget for this agency will be heard on Monday, February 15th, so they've not heard this budget yet.
And we're doing the report out.
I believe the report out is Monday.
We're doing budget recommendations Monday.
Okay, Wednesday then.
Appropriations, final action, then is the 18th. So we'll know, good, by the time we do
I'll
that.
communicate the recommendations from the Joint Building Committee.
It's always
Absolutely.
good to know.
And I would highlight on your budget analysis, you will see that capital improvements budgets that will be reviewed with the Joint Committee on State Building Construction. That begins on page 414 of your budget analysis. That really goes into detail of some of these, I wouldn't say small, but they are fairly routine rehabilitation projects at each of the correctional facilities.
Thank you very much. Okay. Next on the agenda is Jeff Zumuda, Secretary of Department of Corrections. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
I would just like to know who serves.
Are we good to go? Okay.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I appreciate Merle's very in-depth and comprehensive explanation of our budget. That explanation is going to allow me to move pretty quickly through this presentation as not to repeat what he's already said. I'll touch on some key points, particularly those points that I think might be informative for the committee, and certainly at any time along in the presentation or at the end, we'll be happy to respond for questions. As Merle mentioned, I've got my executive team here and online virtually with us. So let me just a quick overview of the governor's recommendations, a little bit about risk reduction programming, those expansion projects at Winfield and Lansing, some of the challenges that we're experiencing, talk a little more in depth about our offender management information systems that we are wanting to replace, and then the federal coronavirus funding. So So there's just a quick overview on this slide about the overall 2021 system-wide budget. There's those phase one of the renovation projects, Winfield and Lansing, fully fund the healthcare contract, the lapsing or the evidence-based programs, unobligated balance, food service contract reduction, contract bed reduction, correctional officer salary for the coronavirus relief fund offset. Merle mentioned that there is a provision within the coronavirus bill that allows for supplementing or offsetting current funding. So that's what's been done with 25 million. We used coronavirus relief funds to fund staffing, and then that money, the general fund money, is reverting back. Next slide, please. FY22 statewide budget. Phase two of those two renovation projects at Winfield and Lansing fully fund the healthcare contract. And I'm going to talk more in depth about the management information system and the juvenile correctional facility system later in the presentation. So I'll talk about that. And Merle already covered the food service operation, the shift of those funds at Larned. This just, I think you got to go back one. Did you? Nope, ahead. Right there. So this slide just reflects how our funds are loaded in the system-wide budget. You can see the expenditures by type on this slide, and as it relates to facility other operating expenses, those are expenses such as clothing, bedding, incentive pay, fuel, that type stuff, maintenance. And then the rent is for central office, parole offices, and the reconstructed facility in Lansing. Then this FY22 expenditures by program, again, just kind of reflects where the funds are going. If you'll take the top two, facility operations and healthcare, those contribute, make up about 71% of our overall budget expenditures. This pie chart reflects the governor's recommendations by funds within the KDOC budget. Again, it's $451.9 million, I believe, total. State general funds make up 88% of that funding. Special revenue funds, 8%. Building funds, 2%. And inmate benefit fund and federal funds are each about 1% of that. And then this next chart with the pie chart and bar graph, illustrates the funds that are spent on reentry and programs within the organization, and it's about 14.5 million. 25% of that go to reentry programs, about 17% to education, 16% to substance abuse programs. We've got third-time DUI treatment, about 11%, sex offender treatment 10%, and contract program providers about 9%, and then there's some that are a little bit smaller than that. So why invest in programming? 98% of adults in KDOC facilities will return to the community. Over 70% of males and over nearly 65% of females come into our facilities have not completed high school and only have a GED. 51% of males, 41% of females on post-release supervision are unemployed or unemployable. 20% of our residents discharged to homelessness. They're turned out in the community without the resources to be successful. 41% of adults and 72% of our youth have mental health needs. And over 70% of our facility admissions report recent drug or alcohol misuse. So there's a real need for resources to provide treatment and resources for reentry back into the community. We know it works. Thinking for the Change, which is a cognitive intervention and skill building program, an evaluation of that program in 2014 found a 7% lower recidivism rate for completers, and that was a higher 23% recidivism reduction for higher risk population. Substance abuse program evaluation in 2016 found about 7.5%
lower recidivism for completers, and nearly 16% for, again, that highest risk population, highest risk to reoffend, that is. And an update in 2020 found that 7% for lower for completers and 14% for females. One of our issues is unmet program needs for those releasing, and this is from data from FY20 overall. For those identified as having a need through assessments, the percent receiving what their need was, only 48% received substance abuse programming or services, only 71% received education and employment services, 23% received that thinking for a change, and 67% received sex offender programming. So another way to look at it, those released back into the community with unmet needs were 52% releasing back needed substance abuse services and were unable to get them. 29% needed education and employment services, and those were unmet. 77% needed cognitive programming that we were not able to deliver to them, and 33% need sex offender programming, and that was not able to be delivered. Factors leading in to not being able to deliver those programs are not enough staff to deliver the programs, not enough space at our facilities to hold more programs, and then not enough time. Many of our population that comes to us don't have enough time to serve with us in order to get that programming. That's about 50% of them that come to us. So that lends itself to a greater need out in the community, maybe on probation before they come to us. Next slide, please. The expansion projects, I think Merle did a great job talking about that. Just briefly say the Winfield expansion project, that is for a geriatric population, cognitive care, predominantly, that's what that's for. There's an element there for population for substance abuse programming and to help assist with that older population, needy population. Next slide, please. Lansing expansion project, that's at what used to be the old Lansing East facility. Again, we estimate about 200 beds for substance abuse treatment for adult males, and we'd renovate that facility. Some of our challenges: high caseloads for counselors, parole officers, and community corrections supervision officers. That would be probation officers. Caseloads are too high, average about 50 per officer for community corrections, and they're as high as 70 in some areas. Caseloads in parole average about 60, and they're up to 80 in some instances. That's way too high. Limited capacity to provide the needed services. I touched on that in an earlier slide.
Mr. Secretary, do you mind being interrupted for a question? Go ahead, Representative Resman.
Mr. Chairman, earlier in corrections today, we heard about a program to reduce the number of people that go to prisons as a result of drug use, and which then would put Randy's familiar with it, and that would put a burden on the probation officers as a result of them not going to prison. I think it was estimated like 300 people a year additional going on to probation. So I'd like to know how many people are being supervised by probation officers right now, on average, each one?
Well, if we go back to my slide here, the caseloads in community corrections probation average about 50 per officer. That's an average. In some districts or jurisdictions, they're as high as 70.
Thank you. I hate to interrupt you, but
no,
I wanted to make sure I get that because we just heard that.
I apologize.
What do the standards say they should be? I mean, I'm sure it varies by the severity of the person that they're watching, but what's an industry guideline, or do you have any idea?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it does depend on the risk of the person. If you have a real low, some instances you can do a bank of a caseload and have hundreds where they hardly ever have to be in contact. I'd say you want those caseloads down in the 40s. The lower the caseload, the more quality, the more time you can invest in the person that needs that help and attention. And of course, the higher the caseload, the less time you have and less quality you can do. Retention of staff, we're losing a lot of experienced, well-trained staff That continues to other agencies. Difficult to social distance within facilities. Certainly the pandemic has brought that out. We have a lot of dormitory-style housing. And our infrastructure, it's old and it lacks the space to conduct the appropriate services that our population needs. Talk a little bit in depth about the Offender Management and Information System, or as we affectionately refer to it, OMIS, and the Juvenile Correctional Facility System, JCFS, and our intent to replace those. So, as Merle pointed out, the governor has a recommendation, supports us replacing those systems. They're old, they're antiquated. They don't reflect today's practices. One was designed in the 1970s. I believe it's based on DOS. That's how old it is. But they don't reflect today's practices, processes, terminology. They're much different today. So, we think they're fragile. Those developers aren't there. Those people that can support those systems, our staff don't necessarily have that expertise. There's hardly anybody around that writes that language anymore. So we believe we need to replace them. That's a $25 million project. It's nearly a 2-year development. Shared system. We'd have both adults and juvenile into the same system, which would be much better than moving from one system between a juvenile system and an adult system. Projected start would be May of this year, and projected completion would be March of 2023. We have about $5 million to begin the project, as Merle pointed out. 5-year amortization schedule. I think maybe you have a copy of the amortization schedule in your budget documents that Merle gave you. Debt service payments would begin in August of 21 with final payment in August of 2026. This slide is that amortization schedule. FY21 direct payment to vendor. Again, payment of the debt service payments, 5 calendar years, 6 fiscal years. Establish a line of credit and start making those payments in February of 2022. Final payment August of 2027. Talk a little bit about federal coronavirus funding. We were awarded nearly $7 million through continuity of operations. Merle touched on those. That includes some pandemic hazard pay for our staff, supplemental staffing salaries and travel expenses. We had to have staff from one facility when we were short-staffed because people were out sick with COVID or they had loved ones in their home that were at risk or had COVID. We had to augment our staffing and we had to put people up to help cover that. Personal protective equipment, of course, equipment to facilitate remote work, whether that be laptops, printers, cell phones, that type of stuff, and then facility improvements and cleaning supplies to provide for better sanitation. Outstanding obligations, jail hold payments, travel, food service expenses, and that pandemic pay. There's still a little bit of that out there. And then there's that offset of $25 million that we've talked about a couple times. That Larned South unit is the former juvenile facility in Larned. We stood that up as an isolation intake unit from the counties to provide a buffer between someone who may come out of the county positive initially before transitioning into our facilities to mitigate the spread. And you can see the expenditures there, and I won't cover all those. There's a bullet here for equipment for parole officers and program staff. Parole, that's primarily mobile printers. And for our program staff, it's video carts where we were able to do virtual programming, wheel a cart in and do virtual programming with our population. You know, there's another round of stimulus from the feds that's coming out and going forward. I'm not unsure if there's going to be any of those funds available for corrections. Not clear at this point. We'll just stay in communication with the recovery office, and if those funds are available to us, we'll try to access those. With that, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, again, thanks for the opportunity to appear, and we'll stand for questions that you may have.
Representative Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Retention of staff. Why is it? Is it pay, and what's the remedy? And do you have a plan?
Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the question. Yeah, so Pay is a part of it. Competitive pay and benefits are always a part of it. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that was probably number one on a lot of people's list. But also the environment we create in our workplace and the way, if we have good equipment, and this was good to us last year and helped us replace some vehicles at the governor's recommendation with support of Legislature. We replaced a bunch of vehicles and a bunch of other equipment that was desperately needed to be replaced. When you've got worn out equipment, you don't have the right work environment, you don't treat people right, they don't stay. I think we treat people right by and large, but we could do better, and we certainly could do a better job of getting our equipment replaced. So part of it's on us to create a great environment, to make people want to come work for us, not leave, want to come work for us, and part of it is the compensation package.
Do you still have competition from other counties paying more money than the state and better benefits?
I believe we do, yeah. We have a real issue in our parole group where we lose a lot of people who are parole officers, if you will, who might go to the federal system or maybe go out to a county where they can make more money or some other entity. Yeah.
I know, doesn't Johnson County and other counties around that area pay more?
I believe they might, yes. Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but it's an issue, and it's not just our enforcement officers or our parole officers or our prison staff. It permeates the organization at every level.
Last question, what's the starting pay?
Starting pay for correctional officer is $18.26. And that has come up substantially since just before I came. We had the incidents, some disturbances, and we bumped, Legislature funded some pay to increase that, and Governor supported that. And so that helped, but we still have issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. I'm really concerned when I keyed in on the central office staffing reduction, where you're going to take at least one position out of all of there's about like 8 or 9 of those bullet points. The top one, evasion and apprehension, basically your cop unit that goes out and finds people. How many people are you actually talking about eliminating or not hiring out of that unit alone?
Chairman, Representative, so in the potential of a 10% holdback, we identified that we would hold back a staff member from each functional area within our headquarters, and I think that was a total of, we thought it would be 12 staff. Subsequently, it didn't look like there needed to be that deep of reduction, so now the governor's recommendation is at six staff positions. We haven't settled exactly what those are going to be yet. We've got some identified. We're going to do it through vacancies that occur naturally. We don't want to lay anybody off. We want to, if a position comes open and we feel we can manage without it, then that'll be a position that we offer up. If it happened to be in the apprehension unit in the EAI group, it would be one position. And if I could add, not all those positions are out apprehending people. Some of those positions are in our facilities, doing important work in terms of gathering intelligence, doing investigations, that type of thing. So there's kind of two wings, two arms of that group.
Yeah, I'm saying that whether they're out actually tracking somebody down or inside, those are, to me, very core safety issues for not only the staff and the people that work in the facilities, but the public as large. And also, can I make a follow-up? There's mention in here about the Winfield Soldiers Home, that there was some renovation projects being done there because you were going to move. Is it geriatric? Is it like senior prison people that are in prison that are of advanced age? There again, to me, it becomes a safety issue to the veterans in that facility there. So could you just go over that, just a little bit, how that's going to be accomplished?
Chairman, Representative. So there's two buildings that were under the authority of the Veterans Home there, Veterans Administration, if you will, here in Kansas, and they were underutilized. I don't believe they've housed anybody in there in quite some time, and maybe they've used them for storage or some offices, but they weren't utilized. One of those was kind of designed as a long-term care living unit. So they're in close proximity to both the Veterans Home and in close proximity to our facility. They're right there adjacent to it. We have an aging population, geriatric, if you will, getting older, infirmed, a lot of cognitive care issues, whether it be dementia or Alzheimer's, and we kind of need a specialty unit. That made sense to use that. It is separate from a little bit of distance from the Veterans Home. We're going to have a management fence around it. It is going to be that older population with the exception of some drug and alcohol programming for a little bit younger population because they'll also assist that population with some of their needs. We think we can do that safely. What a good safety component that will come from that project is today we have a population that goes down the kitchen services for both the Veterans Home and for our Winfield facility are both housed down directly in the middle of the Veterans facility. So we have a population that goes down there to help prepare the meals, help get them ready, and they're down there in pretty close proximity to the veterans who are housed there. Now, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any incidents there, but there's been some concern expressed about that from family members of the veterans. And of course, the administration of the Veterans Home has talked to us about that. So kind of a win-win here is this project calls for building a new kitchen and dining facility up at the Winfield Correctional Facility. It allows us to get our population out of there because those meals were being shipped from the Veterans Home up to feed our population. We'll no longer need to do that, and it'll create more distance there.
Is there going to be the opportunity for some of the cost savings that we saw when you did the same thing at Larned with that switch in cooking facilities?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure we're familiar with what their costs of the budget are. Probably be a wash, would be my guess at this point. We can find out. We'll look into that and come back to you.
I just remember there was some substantial savings when you made that switch from Larned State Hospital to the correctional facility there.
Absolutely.
Representative Delperdang.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for being here. So we covered a lot of information. I'd love to have the floor for the next hour, but you wouldn't like that.
Well, you know, honestly, this is one of the biggest budgets we do, and Representative, I want everybody to feel good about the decisions we make. So, unfortunately, it's hard to, it should be easier than this to get two things done in one meeting, shouldn't it?
Yeah, it should be.
But feel free to ask your questions.
Okay. The first slide I'm keying up on is your unmet program needs, and I'm asking this from an ally. I'm not trying to push you around anywhere, but when we're looking at what's not being met, and yet we're also looking at substantial budget cuts, what's the ramifications here?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative, well, the ramifications could be more of the same. People come into prison. We do need to find a way to get the resources out on the front end, out in the community, to try to keep people, diverting people that may not need to come to prison out there. Get their needs met, get them supported, get them on their feet, get them stabilized, help supervise them, and get them out there. And community corrections, you know, that they have the same funding issues. They get some of their funding from us, and there hasn't been an increase in that in a number of years, and so everybody's looking for resources. Resources out in the community on the front end would be a big key.
Okay. The next page, you went over the expansion projects, Winfield in particular, but on 365 of the budget, it talks about the cancellation of the expansion projects at Lansing and Winfield. So are we expanding or is it canceled?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative, well, if the committee approves the budget, we're expanding. So again, in that potential 10% holdback, we had to offer up, make some tough decisions, and we had offered, well, we haven't really started any construction on these projects. Maybe that funding could go back to help balance the budget. Along the way, that appears to not be necessary, and so now they would be, if it's approved, they would be funded and we would be moving forward.
So that's on the positive note.
Yeah.
Page 367, and again, I don't know if you've got this information, but it was talking about the central office staffing reduction, and we were eliminating funding for 12 FTEs, totaling $1.9 million. That's about $175,000 per person. That seems pretty high.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I think that's with benefits and everything.
It was just an interesting number
I'll
to
defer
me.
Keith. He'll dig in and look at that number and see if he can clarify before we leave here.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. I'm almost done.
Oh, you're fine.
The food contract, when we're going from $4.50 a meal down to $1.60, I'm questioning what are the ramifications there? What are we really getting into here?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative, that reduced cost is what our actual costs are so we have a contract through Aramark. So at all of our facilities, that's the budgeted amount that they provide meals for. The higher amount was when those meals were being provided through I think it's a contract for the state hospital.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we were under the state hospital contract, it was 460 something or whatever that number is. If we pull back from that and we put the feeding of our population under the Aramark contract, it'll drop to the $1.60. And if we need more detail or talk about it more, Keith can come up and talk about it more.
And then on your data management system, there was two budgets given to us. One that I think was probably presented, and the other one that the governor liked. Some difference in dollar amounts, but the question is it the same equipment? Is it going to meet the needs? Or are we just financing it differently with the same equipment is what the question is?
Chairman, Representative, that's exactly what it is. Instead of lump sum monies, it's a little bit of upfront money and then financing it out over the years.
Okay. And I was concerned about if it's the same equipment, if you will, as Department of Labor. We all know how that's been working out for us. But I keep hearing over and over and over, it's a system that went online in the 70s. DOS really wasn't even there. MS-DOS wasn't developed till the 80s, so I'm assuming it's in a mainframe of some sort. And if it's 1970s, we're talking 14-inch platters for a single meg of data. So where is all of the correctional data stored? Unless you've got another building of this size of platters sitting around. I mean, I'm just miffed on that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I'd have to ask our IT guy what magic he's doing. You know, it's a tenuous system. We're concerned about it collapsing. That's not exaggerating it. You know, there's things we don't do with it some maintenance that could be performed on it that we don't do because our staff are concerned it'll go down and they won't be able to bring it back up.
I appreciate everybody being here, so thank you.
Thank you. You bet.
Other questions?
Mr. Chairman, can I make one more comment about the retention and whatnot? And I overlooked, and I apologize, it occurred to me a little later. Part of our retention issues in the pay, and I talked about the pay following those disturbances, and specifically, I think the El Dorado disturbance bumped up that pay. And that was a pretty substantial, I think 18% pay increase for our uniform staff. And we were able to apply that statewide, and we're very grateful for that. And it did make a difference. The unintended consequence of that is we have a number of pay grades that are the same as correctional officers or correctional sergeants or correctional lieutenants. They're in non-uniform positions, but they're in the same pay grade. That pay increase did not go to them. So now we have some pay disparity, not only between agencies, as I talked about, where we lose people to other agencies, but we have some problems internally that we need to address. And so that's another issue for us. Thank you for giving me that opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, sure. Does anybody else have any other questions before I start trying to remember all the questions I've had that I've tried to be quiet on? Don't look at me like that, Representative Hauser. I saw that look of grimness. So what is the shrinkage rate that you're budgeted at right now? Do you know, or does Keith know?
It varies across each facility and each program within central office, so I can get that information and get that to you. I don't have that on me right now.
Okay. And then, I remember when Lansing, I think, first reopened, we had some real concerns about the sight lines in the new facility. How did that progress? Did we need to improve or increase the staffing to minimize those sightline issues, or were we able to make it work like it was originally planned to work?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, it's my understanding the initial development of the initial staffing is not how we're staffed today. There were a couple revisions over the years where people came in and said, hey, this isn't adequate, it's not going to make it. So the staffing today is not what it was initially proposed for Lansing. I will tell you, the facility is much welcome improvement in terms of safety and security and just overall environment over the old Lansing facility.
So to go back to one of the items Representative Delperdang brought up, my understanding is the Winfield and the Lansing drug treatment things, basically they got delayed a year is what happened in reality because of COVID. I mean, and then we had a change in funds from your state general fund funding to the state building fund. Am I understanding it pretty much correctly?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, they were delayed a little bit, so we've transferred, here's where we stand today. We transferred the title to the two buildings at Winfield from veterans. Those are our buildings now. We have architects and engineers selected for both sites, and we're just starting the development and design phase.
So a couple of years ago, the buzzword was Hep C. I mean, that was the thing we were really concerned about. How has that treatment process been rolling out through the institution? I know it doesn't get the press it used to get.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that's gone very well, very, very well. That pricing keeps coming down. Our healthcare provider is doing a good job of getting out on top of it. There was a little bit of a gap as we transitioned from one health provider to the other, but here in Kansas, doing a really good job of getting that population that needs to be treated.
You know what our treatment cost per person is now? And what percentage of the population we've got treatment for, if that's available?
The average cost is still, we're looking at about $15,000, though we are seeing more and more of the patients using the Maverick, which is a bit more of an expensive drug. However, it's an 8-week duration and covers multiple genotypes, so they're able to process more through the program using that. Right now, with the delays that occurred with really what happened was with the pandemic when it started, all the off-site appointments for workups ceased. So part of that process was someone had to go off-site for, say, an ultrasound as part of their workup. So all those services stopped. So treatment ended up tapering off pretty quickly at the end of the last fiscal year. Still able to treat 444 last fiscal year. And then once things started opening back up, Centurion got in place and got their systems up and running again. They've started to ramp up treatment. We've had about 42 treated so far this fiscal year, with another 42 or 43 on treatment right now. And we have 141 that are identified as positive who will require treatment. The other issue, going back to a point made earlier with the decline in admissions, is the number that are infected has declined quite a bit. We're projecting probably about 500 this fiscal year would have to be treated. And at the current numbers right now, we're probably going to be closer to 200 or so, based on the very limited data we've got right now today.
So another question I had. So I'm in favor of increasing efficiency through technology if we can. I noticed that the governor's, or it appears when I'm looking at it, that the governor's cost of the software upgrade, that plan is around $25 million. Your initial plan was about $20 million. Why is there the $5 million overall difference in cost? And my understanding is $5 million extra went to Microsoft. At least we have a bullet point that says something to that extent.
Mr. Bradshaw address that, Mr. Chairman.
So the number that was in the original budget request that was submitted in September was for a $20 million project, and it had a different financing model. After that budget submitted, the CIO and I and a few other staff continue to look at other options and a little bit further discussions on what the project cost should really look like. So that $20 million project cost was under a shorter time frame. I want to say it was in the 58-week time frame, roughly, which would have required a lot more staff time on our part, our staff being involved with the daily processes and the development and testing, to the point where they probably wouldn't be able to do their jobs that they've been hired to do in the first place. And so that just resulted in some additional delays in the project. So we settled on 25 million be a more realistic project amount, stretch that to 96 weeks or 98 weeks. So we're not burning out our staff, and they can actually focus on their jobs during the development piece of it. So that's where the extra 5 million came in from the original request to what was approved by the governor's office. And then the other part was a different financing model that was a lot more beneficial, where we can access the $20 million line of credit versus the $9 million that was available under the original proposal.
Yeah, and the interest rate on that, it's like 1.5%, isn't that right?
0.4 something.
Or I remember it was something like that. So I'm still having troubles with the $5 million. You're saying it's one of those things where you're going to probably wind up having a similar number either way?
The $5 million is the two different issues, really. One was the change in the project scope, where we increased the project cost itself from 20 to 25 million. The other piece was the $5 million that's in our budget today, which is what we're going to utilize. Either scenario, we would have used that money to get the project going and then finance the remaining balance moving forward, and starting in
So from the time you made your initial projections to the time the governor did it, you broadened the scope is the primary increase in scope
in the project cost, correct, and then found a different financing mechanism to cover that.
So, one of the things that I think might happen is, I think there's some concern by some members of the legislature about the sweep of the 42 million from the juvenile prevention funds. I was wondering if you had any comments or would like to comment on the 1.5 million that Representative Jennings discussed with us, transferring so that community corrections, juvenile corrections groups could use those for grants.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I think the purpose of the lapse in the funding is, or the sweeping of it, if you will, is to help balance the state budget. And we fully support the governor's recommendation to do that. It needs to be balanced. We understand that. None of the services that are being offered today will be impacted by that sweep. And for the out years, for quite a few years here, about 7 or 8 years, there's a funding source already in place to sustain what we're already doing. So we support the recommendation for the sweep and leave it to y'all to figure out what's the best way forward.
And do you have can you see any big problems with the $1.5 million we want to transfer from that fund, if we leave it there anyway, to grant funds for juvenile corrections agencies across the state to use for prevention programs?
Well, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, if funds are there and they're available, they'll be utilized.
Let's see, it seemed like there was one other thing, if I can remember what it was that I wanted to ask. Oh, and Keith, you've got a little more institutional knowledge, but Representative Jennings's thought process about the proviso, has there been any studies done? I've heard that concept of the 3 regional juvenile corrections facilities versus the one that we have in Topeka right now, kicked around for years. Any thoughts on any of y'all's thought about that concept that he mentioned to us today?
Well, Mr. Chairman.
Randy's.
Oh, come on. I'll let Randy speak to it.
I'll put on my past hat from Juvenile Services. Randy Bowman, Executive Director of Public Affairs. And for those of you who may not know, when there was a former separate agency and deputy secretary, I fulfilled that role for a few years. So as Chairman said, he's right. That has become the norm in the United States, to have smaller, more family-like, less institutional, less adult-like facilities for kids. I'm not aware, Mr. Chairman, of any studies really around that, but I am aware of California. Boy, I have to think back in my hair. I'm aware of some states who have gone down that path. I think Texas has done a little bit of that. So it's becoming the new norm, because in the 1990s, we built these facilities and started treating children exactly like adults, and the pendulum has swung back to realize we weren't getting very good results from that. So not studies, but yes, it's becoming a trend and a norm in the industry. Help some?
So is that something you could do internally, or would you have to hire a agency to, an outside consultant to do the study?
We would need to get some external help, I'm pretty certain on that, because you're talking about design and and architecture and that kind of thing.
Got any idea what a study like that would cost, just a preliminary study?
I don't, but I'll make note and see what we can get for you.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Representative Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the second time. Mr. Secretary, one of the things that we kind of touched on that we haven't really talked about is, well, we talked about with the Winfield situation, is healthcare and medical devices and medications that are given to the inmates. Is that handled, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, are the medical staff within the facilities, are they employees of the state of Kansas, or are they contracted employees? And then I have follow-up for depending on that.
Chairman, Representative, the Centurion is a healthcare provider. They're our contractor, and so our healthcare staff in the facilities are their employees. We contract with them for that service.
So follow up on that. Do they generate and maintain all of the medical records on all of the inmates inside?
Yes, they do, Representative,
So
yes.
they have their own computers or systems to keep track of that? In other words, I guess what I'm asking is, are the same mainframes, software, hardware that are used to keep track of the people inside for other reasons also being used by the medical people, or do they have their own systems that they rely on separate from the state of Kansas?
Chairman, Representative, well, they maintain an electronic medical health record, if you will, for that population, and probably some hard records as well. Those are not in our offender management system, so people can go in and access all that privileged health information. So they are separate. Now we contract with KU Medical. They provide oversight of that contract. They do the monitoring, so they have access to that, and they're ensuring that the quality of care is appropriate.
That was going to be my next question, is who does oversight on them to make sure they're... So,
KU Med does.
KU, okay.
And do a great job.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Oh, I thought about the question I had. So going back to the juvenile prevention funds that are in the governor's budget to sweep, we did some background on that, and it looked like 1 year there was $4 million that went in there. 1 year there was $5 million that went in there. I think last year maybe $9 million went into there, and then this year $59,000 I think went in there. Do you know what that discrepancy is and how that came about?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have Keith respond to that because I think he knows it for sure. I think I know, but I'd rather have Keith respond.
Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
This would be in relation to the Evidence-Based Programs Fund. There's a separate prevention fund in the juvenile world, but
Yeah, you have to watch me. I will get everything.
it's easy to get them much together.
Yeah.
So the way that fund was set up with the simple 367 is the savings from youth residential center placements or group homes out in the community, and savings from the juvenile correctional facilities that are realized through the reforms would go from those budget units over to the evidence-based programs fund. And so shortly after the bill was passed, that's when the population declined at the Larner Juvenile Correctional Facility to the point where it could be closed. Some funding followed the youth to KJCC, the rest went into that fund. And the numbers of youth in the YRCs fell off quite rapidly after the bill was passed. So those savings were then moved over. So it's really moving the base appropriation that was in those funds for KJCC, Larner at the time, and for the YRCs were being taken out from those appropriations and transferred over to the evidence-based programs fund and now built into the base. So we're just doing that shift year over year, sometimes twice a year. Early on, following the passage of the bill, we're projecting out what the cost would be for the YRCs. So that number dropped from, I think, is around $16 million per year is what we were spending on the YRCs when the bill passed, moving that budget authority over to the evidence-based programs fund, and then that resides there. So where that number has now shrunk down from $60 million to about $900,000. And so that's what's available left on that side of the ledger that could potentially move over to the fund. Same with the KJCC side of the equation, and that $54,000 was simply just the leftover funds from FY20 that then reappropriated, and those were the savings realized through the reform, so that was then transferred over there. And so we'd see that same process occur again next year, probably smaller because we've shifted the bulk of those savings already over to the fund. Right. Right. And that's, again, the bulk of it was because we went from 16 million starting a few years ago, and that several million has been moved out of that fund over time, and we made the big change, the big shift going into this fiscal year. Actually been doing the planning process 2 summers ago to move that money over there from YRC over to Evidence-Based Programs Fund, reducing that appropriation, if you will, for YRCs and increasing the one for evidence-based programs. So now there's just a smaller piece of the pie left available moving forward to reduce as that population declines on the YRC side. Not very easily, but I can try and get you something. Okay. Okay.
I mean, understand.
Kind of going along, it looks kind of normal, and then all of a sudden it's like, wait, why did it go from 9 million to 59,000?
Okay. Okay.
All right. I need to turn mine on. Any other questions? Okay. We're going to move on. We have a number of members from across the state that would like to testify. And it's next on the agenda is Ann Carpenter. Ann, can you hear us, Ann?
Yep. Can you hear me?
A little bit. Can we help her voice? Now try it. Now try it.
Is this any better?
Yep.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Good evening, Chairman Francis and committee members. I want to thank you for allowing me to speak in favor of the proposal that Chairman Jennings brought forth earlier in your lengthy meeting. I will primarily read from the testimony that I submitted earlier this week. I and several directors support transferring funds from the Evidence-Based Practices Fund to the Prevention Grant for the purpose of serving at-risk youth prior to entering the system. Our support is also for local JCABs and county commissions to decide which programs they choose to fund in their particular areas. If communities are going to be relied upon to serve most of the adjudicated population in Kansas, we need the best tools available for prevention and intervention. Prevention is a wise investment, but is restricted and underfunded in most judicial districts. I know in my district, we get about $40,000. We serve Big Brothers Big Sisters, Tri-County CASA, and the local Child Advocacy Center. They each get about $13,000. The cost for prevention is less expensive than incarceration. The cost per student for programs like JAG-K, which is what our district would like to fund, is approximately $15,000 per year per student. Our cost of housing a juvenile in detention, not the correctional facility, but detention, is $150 a day. The facility is much higher. Unfortunately, current restrictions on evidence-based program funds do not allow full funding of JAG-K because while it's both an intervention and prevention program, it serves students that have not gone through intake and assessment or have had contact with the justice system. Helping students graduate and getting on a successful career path gives them an overwhelmingly better chance of avoiding poverty and other risk factors associated with justice system involved youth. The state has over $40 million sitting in a fund that could have been spent to attempt to lower the juvenile recidivism rate and reduce the number of youth that receive an intake through prevention programs. Underutilization has caused the EBP fund to be a target for other uses. The governor's budget calls for $43 million to be removed from the EBP fund to fund other areas in the state budget. Rather than protecting the money from serving juveniles outside our justice system, perhaps some of that money could be used to keep youth out of the justice system and reducing the pipeline to prison. There's support in communities to ask for support from the legislature to transfer a small amount of the fund to the prevention block grants. But it needs to be enough to actually make a difference, and it needs to be sustainable to the best of our ability as a state. I'm asking you to consider approving this step toward greater focus on prevention and improve the transfer of funds. On a personal note, back in '98, when I was hired, juvenile justice reform took flight in Kansas, and then Governor Bill Graves, Senator David Adkins, and JJA Commissioner Albert Murray spoke of the future. That future was after getting a good system and practices in place for our offending youth and driving down the costs for the youth in the system, was a desire and a promise that Kansas would shift funding to prevention programs to actually keep kids out of the system. Now, after 23 years, you have a chance, and we can actually do that. I'll be retiring in 13 months. I'd really like to see this happen. You have the signature line that has several directors' names. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Any questions for Ms. Carpenter? If not, thank you, ma'am. We appreciate your testimony. You did a great job.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And what was it? Were you concerned about vertical stripes or something, you know, on the WebEx? Was that a comment you made to me at one time?
Yeah,
I think you chose well.
Horizontal stripes.
Okay. Thank you again. Next on the agenda is Chuck Knapp with JAG Kansas. Chuck, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I have submitted written testimony and just generally would testify that we are in support of giving the local corrections officials flexibility in funding prevention programs. We have been asked to provide those services at intervention. It's our opportunity to help these students stay out of the system entirely. We have a great track record in Kansas, a 97% graduation rate over the last 3 years. We address many of the risk factors that you see with adjudicated youth. And certainly we know that local corrections officials know how to best serve their students. So I would be glad to stand for questions if you have any.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Knapp? If not, thank you for your testimony, sir.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is Stuart Little. Stuart?
Back again, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Stuart Little, Kansas Community Corrections Association. I'm just going to briefly make two comments that connect up with the other issues that you've been hearing about here today. First is the Juvenile Evidence-Based Practice Fund. Ms. Carpenter is one of the members of the Kansas Community Corrections Association, and this is a topic that we wanted to raise with you all, and I just wrote some general language about hoping that you all may have the desire to take some of that 42, 43, 44 million that the governor is going to recommend in her budget, sweeping and capturing some of those funds. There are an infinite amount of needs in the system, in the juvenile system. These dollars were saved because we stopped sending kids off to out-of-home placements. move them to the community, give them treatment and services. Some of those components are going really, really well, but there is a need to expand that and provide more of those services. So I appreciate Chairman Jennings coming in and asking for $1.5 million into the budget process to be devoted towards some of those activities. If at some point you all are going to be battling with the Senate, maybe you should ask for more money so we end up with a reasonable amount of money at the end of the process. But we're supportive of that. That's something that lots of community corrections agencies will be able to use. The other issue, the Secretary mentioned some of in conversations about community corrections salaries. Community corrections employees are employees of the county. They work for the county. They are funded through the grants that come from the Department of Corrections. There's some information in my report about how the grant funding for adults, the juvenile population's low, getting lower, but for adults, it's going up. And there's information in my testimony about the salary, the funding dropping over the last several years, in the last 6-7 years, while the average daily population, meaning those we supervise, is going up. As counties increase their costs for health care, for retirement, any of those, all those things that the county does, the community corrections districts are trying to keep up with that, and the only resources they have are from, unless their counties are kicking in any contributions, are from the state. We've been working on this. We've had meetings with the Department of Corrections to talk about this, and I note that, and we're having those conversations. We would love for you all to, and I think the conversation you had in full appropriations this morning about court service officers, that's part of the issue. Is court services officers have received a couple of bumps. Parole officers received a bump, I think, in the last couple of years. And so community corrections folks now have that ongoing cycle of a battle. How do we keep our people from moving around? We would love for you all to include in your report a recommendation to the Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight that they look at this adult corrections funding as an interim study topic, and I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Any questions for Mr. Little? Okay, any questions for any of the conferees before they get out the door? All right, okay, we're going to move on to the next item on the agenda, which is our budget recommendations for the Board of Indigence Defense Services. So the chair would entertain a moment to a motion to approve the governor's recommendation for fiscal year 2021. Is there a motion? That would be you, Vice Chair. I'm sorry. No. Yes. Board of Indigent Defense Services. Sentencing is going to happen tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that we pass out the governor's recommended budget for the Board of Indigent Defense Services for 2021.
Okay, is there a second? Second is by Representative Ellis. You know, I want to say to the committee, and Ms. Cessna is here to answer any questions as we move forward on this. I believe that there is a serious issue here, and I think it's important for us to show that we're moving forward so we limit any court cases that might question the fact that we're addressing a problem. None of those expenditures are in 2021's budget. They all, the enhancements are in 2022. Isn't that correct, Ms. Cessna? Okay. So I just want to make any of you that want to try to do something on this aware that we'll start to discuss that in the fiscal year 2022 budget. So is there any other discussion? If not, would you like to move your motion? Okay. All those in favor of accepting the governor's recommendation for fiscal year 2021 signify by saying aye. All opposed, no. All opposed, no. Motion carries. Next issue is the fiscal year 2022. Let's start out with the governor's recommendation.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we pass out the governor's recommended budget for 2022 for the Board of Indigent Defense Services.
Is there a second? Second is by Representative Weigel, and we're open for discussion. this is a little bit of a delicate situation. There's been discussion in House appropriations that we pull all raises out of the budget. They've got a $4.1 million enhancement that was accepted by the governor. You know, honestly, I think that's the maximum enhancement. This is a serious fiscal situation that we're going to work through for the next year or two. It does look like it's getting better, but it's still an issue. In appropriations today, there was a substantial increase in wages for the judges. It got taken out. I don't believe that Ms. Cessna's issues are solved by more salaries for the existing personnel she has, even though that does help with retention. I'm not arguing that. The governor has a 2.5% increase in her budget. I think we would be ahead as we move forward to not concur with the governor's $4.1 million funding for recruitment and retention, and instead do something. Ms. Cessna, could you come to the mic? I've got a question for you. Now, part of your original presentation, or part of your original request to the governor, I believe it had $164,000 for upgrades to the office, some infrastructure type things, and it also had $200,000 for a case management system. I'm very much in favor of the case management system because I think it's going to make all of their existing workforce more efficient. Do you need $364,000 for the case management system and those office modifications?
I think what you're referring to is we had a request for some IT security enhancement, but that was actually granted by the governor as part of her recommendations in fiscal year 2021.
Okay.
So that's part of the one that you've already discussed. And then additionally, we had some an additional request for extra money for laptops and things like that, but that was one of the things that we ended up getting CRF funding for after we submitted the budget.
That's right.
So the only part of that that's left is the $200,000 for the case management.
So I would like to amend their request to remove the $4.1 million for recruitment and retention and replace that with one recommendation for $200,000 for a case management system, and then $3.9 million for, is it 26 new attorneys?
26 new public defenders, and then as much additional of the staffing as we can essentially get with the rest of that money.
And then funding for legal assistance, administrative assistance, and training personnel for the balance for the balance.
Yeah, we had requests for legal assistance, investigators, administrative assistants, and then 6 different administrative staff, including training director and some IT staff and data analysts and things like that.
So I would make that motion for $200,000 there, $3.9 million in new funding. In essence, the dollars are going to be awash with the governor's recommendation. It's not any new money, but we're going to be moving forward to address this situation. Is there a second to my motion? Second by Representative Delberding. Do you understand what we're doing here, Merle? Okay. Is there any discussion on the motion? Or on the amendment, excuse me? That's right, and we're kind of relabeling it to something that is going to more directly address their needs. There will be a 2.5%, there could be a 2.5% increase that's going to happen globally in the state government, so yeah. Okay, yes?
First, I understand exactly what you're doing, so that's good, but are you, overall, are you comfortable with, and where do you perceive it will go when you're in front of appropriations?
I think I think a lot of people on appropriations are concerned about possible lawsuits if we don't start to address the issue.
No,
I mean,
it's the same amount of money, you're just moving it around a little bit, and I may be killing a couple birds with it, so I like what I see, so.
yes, Merle.
Mr. Chairman, Martin DeBeer is the analyst, and if you want, he can repeat what the motion is and clarify so everybody is on the same page.
Yeah, Merle, or Martin, do you want to repeat it back? I'm sorry, Merle's right here, and so I got confused. It's easy for that to happen to me.
No, quite all right, Mr. Chairman. So the recommendation is to not fund the 4.1 million that the governor had assigned to the recruitment and retention, but add the $200,000 for the case management system and the $3.9 million for the additional funding for the ethical caseload staffing portion of the enhancement. Is that correct?
And also for additional legal assistance and administrative assistance and training personnel to, what's the right word, assist them? That may not be quite the right word.
Correct.
All of those were included as the part of that staffing request. Yeah.
Any other discussion on the amendment? I guess that's, okay, so let's vote on the amendment then. I move my amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. I'd also like to make another note on this budget when we go forward, and it's going to signify more that we would look favorably on future recommendations according to their, what's your phase one of the, what was the name of the plan?
It was our 2020 report on the status of public defense in Kansas, and it would be that phase one list of items that we requested.
Yeah, that we would look favorably upon additional expenditures of phase one of the Board of Indigence Services. What was the rest of it?
The report on the status of public defense.
You can get that wording right for me, can't you, Martin? To be implemented over the next 4 years, let's say. So I would make that motion. Is there a second? Second is by Representative Resman. Is there any discussion? If not, I move my motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. And now would you like to make a motion to move the 2022 budget as, or is there any other amendments to the budget? Okay, would you like to make a motion to move it as amended?
My motion as amended for 2022.
Did we do that right, Chris? Okay. All right. All those in favor of approving the Board of Indigent Services budget for 2022 as amended, signify by saying aye. All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. All right. Committee, tomorrow we will do recommendations on the KBI and Sentencing Commission. We will not have a meeting Friday. And then just so you'll know kind of what's coming up ahead, we'll do Department of Corrections budget recommendations on Monday. So that's kind of what we have to look forward to. We'll do a budget hearing on Kansas Department of Transportation on the 16th. Probably do a hearing on that bill on the 17th. I think we're working on that schedule. The bill, if everybody will remember, it was the change in the allocation of the $100,000 fee for the state general fund for the state fire marshal's budget. So, and yes, we could probably, we'll have him here to testify, so we could ask some additional questions. Okay. If there's nothing else for the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you.